The country you were born in is 250 years old. This year, and a British general who studied every empire that has ever existed across 3,000 years of recorded history found that the average lifespan of an empire is 250 years. Not approximately, not roughly, 250. He studied the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the British. 11 empires, every single one followed the same 7 stages in the same order. And every single one collapsed within a generation of reaching stage 6. The United States of America just entered stage 6, and you are living inside the pattern right now without knowing which stage you are in, how many are left, or what happens when the last one arrives. A British historian named Sir John Bankrupt Glubb published an essay in 1976 called The Fate of Empires. 26 pages, almost nobody has read it. And it maps the life cycle of every major civilization onto a 7-stage pattern that the United States follows with a precision that should terrify anyone who understands what Stage 7 looks like. Stage 1, military overextension, completed decades ago. 750 bases in 80 countries. $1 billion a day war in Iran. Stage 2, currency debasement, completed in 1971 when Nixon took the dollar off gold, and it has lost 97% of its purchasing power since. Stage 3, the debt spiral, completed when interest on the $39 trillion national debt exceeded $1 trillion, and the government started borrowing to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity, completed when the country that once manufactured 28% of the world's goods started importing gasoline from China. Stage 5, social decay, completed when 264,000 Americans started dying of despair every year, and 90% of the country called it a mental health crisis, and Congress hit 7% public confidence. 5 stages done. Stage 6, the loss of reserve currency status, has just begun. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen to 56.9%, the lowest since 1995. BRICS has more economic weight than the G7. $25 trillion flows through China's alternative payment system every year. And the Iran war is accelerating the process, because every country that was sanctioned concluded that any currency that can be weaponized against them is a currency they need to replace. Stage 7 is the sudden collapse. Spain went from the richest empire on earth to bankruptcy in 80 years. Britain went from victory in World War II to dependency in 26 years. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existence in 900 days. This video walks you through all 7 stages, shows you the data that confirms where America is on the timeline, and tells you exactly what to build before the pattern reaches the stage that nobody inside an empire has ever been prepared for. A British general studied 11 empires across 3,000 years and found that every single one collapsed in the same 7 stages, in the same order within 250 years, and the United States turns 250 this year. In 1976, Lieutenant General Sir John Bankrupt Glubb, a British soldier who commanded the Arab Legion in Jordan for 26 years and spent his retirement studying the patterns of civilization, published an essay called The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival. It is 26 pages long. It is free to read. Almost nobody has read it, and it is the most accurate predictive framework for the decline of the United States that has ever been written, published 50 years before the decline became visible to the general public. Glubb studied 11 empires across 3,000 years of recorded history. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arab Empire, the Mameluki Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Romanov-Russian Empire, the British Empire, and each one, regardless of geography, regardless of religion, regardless of technology, regardless of the specific political structure, followed the same life cycle, the same 7 stages, in the same order, and the total duration of the cycle, from the first stage to the last, averaged approximately 250 years, 10 generations. That is the lifespan of an empire. Not a theory, an observation based on 3,000 years of data. And the 7 stages that Glubb identified are the age of pioneers, the age of conquests, the age of commerce, the age of affluence, the age of intellect, the age of decadence, and the age of decline and collapse. And in January 2026, The Voice of India published a comprehensive analysis applying Glubb's framework to the United States with current economic data. And Dwyoan News published a separate analysis in the same month documenting that analysts suggest the U.S. is deep inside the pattern. And a Medium analysis from February 2026 mapped the 7 stages against modern economic indicators and concluded that the United States is already in stage 5. And here is the detail that should make every American sit up straight. The United States declared independence in 1776. It is 2026. The country is 250 years old. 250. The exact average lifespan of an empire in Glob's data. Now I am not telling you the world is ending. I am not telling you the country disappears next Tuesday. Empires do not collapse like buildings. They collapse like marriages. Slowly at first, then all at once. And the process is not mystical. It is economic, it is structural, it is measurable. And it follows a pattern that has repeated across every civilization that has ever achieved dominance and then lost it. And the modern economic version of Glob's framework, which has been adapted by historians, economists, and geopolitical analysts, identifies 7 stages that map with surgical precision onto the current American trajectory. Stage 1 is military overextension. Stage 2 is currency debasement. Stage 3 is the debt spiral. Stage 4 is the loss of productive capacity. Stage 5 is social decay. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status. Stage 7 is the sudden collapse. 5 of those stages are complete. America just entered stage 6. And this video is going to walk you through each one, show you the data that confirms it, compare it to what happened to Spain and Britain and the Soviet Union at the same stage, and by the end you will understand not just that the pattern exists, but exactly where the United States sits on the timeline and how much time remains before the 7th stage begins. Because Glob's framework does not predict the future, it describes the present. And the present for the United States of America at 250 years old matches the pattern that has ended every empire before it. Stage 1. Military overextension was completed decades ago, and the United States now maintains 750 military bases in 80 countries while fighting a $1 billion a day war. It cannot afford with an army, it cannot staff. Every empire that has ever collapsed began the same way. It expanded its military commitments beyond the point that its economy could sustain. Not because the generals were reckless, because the empire's identity became fused with its military reach. Rome did not need to garrison Britannia and Germania and Judea and Egypt and North Africa and Iberia simultaneously. But the Roman identity required it. The legions were not just a military force, they were the symbol of Roman civilization. Withdrawing a legion from a province was not a strategic decision. It was an admission that Rome was retreating. And admissions of retreat are political suicide in every empire that has ever existed. So the legions stayed, and the cost of maintaining them consumed an ever larger share of the imperial budget, and the tax burden required to fund them crushed the productive economy, and the empire hollowed out from the inside while the perimeter remained intact, giving the appearance of strength long after the reality had shifted to fragility. The United States completed this stage decades ago. The Department of Defense maintains approximately 750 military bases and installations in at least 80 countries and territories around the world, according to the Base Structure Report and independent analyses by David Vine at American University. 750. That is more foreign military installations than any empire in the history of the world has ever maintained. The British Empire at its absolute peak had roughly 36 major military installations globally. Rome at its peak had approximately 30 legionary fortresses plus a network of auxiliary forts. The United States has 750, and the defense budget to maintain them is $886 billion per year, with a proposed increase to $1.5 trillion. That is larger than the next 10 countries combined, including China and Russia. And the empire is now fighting a war in Iran that costs approximately $1 billion per day. Operation Epic Fury, launched on February 28, 2026. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed for over 100 days. The cost ratio, according to Pentagon analysts, is approximately 200 to 1. For every dollar Iran spends on asymmetric defense, the United States spends $200 on precision-guided munitions, carrier strike group operations, aerial refueling, intelligence surveillance, and the logistics of projecting power 7,000 miles from the homeland. And the military that is fighting this war cannot recruit enough soldiers to fill its own ranks. Only 23% of Americans aged 17 to 25 are eligible to enlist without a waiver. 77% are disqualified by obesity, mental health issues, drug use, or education failures. The Army raised the enlistment age to 42. It is paying $50,000 signing bonuses, and the Hoover Institution documented that beginning in 2026, a 10% annual reduction in the number of eligible young people turning 18 will hit due to the Great Recession birth rate decline. The pool of potential soldiers is shrinking at the exact moment the demands on the military are expanding. Spain experienced the same overextension in the 16th and 17th centuries. It fought wars across multiple continents simultaneously. The Dutch Revolt, the wars in Italy, the campaigns in the New World, the Armada against England, and the cost of maintaining those commitments bankrupted the empire 4 times. 4 separate sovereign bankruptcies. And each time, Spain borrowed more to fund the next war, and the debt compounded, and the empire shrank. Not because it was defeated on the battlefield, because it was defeated by the ledger. Britain experienced it after World War II. The cost of maintaining the empire, the bases in India, the garrisons in Africa, the naval presence in the Pacific, exceeded what the post-war economy could sustain. And within 20 years, the empire was dissolved, not conquered. Dissolved. Because the math did not work. The United States has 750 bases, a $1.5 trillion defense budget, a $1 billion a day war, and 77% of its young people ineligible to serve. Stage 1 is not approaching. Stage 1 was completed long ago. The overextension is the foundation on which every subsequent stage was built, and the empire's inability to recognize that the foundation has cracked is itself a symptom of the pattern. Stage 2, currency debasement, was completed the day Richard Nixon took the dollar off gold in 1971, and since that moment, your currency has lost 97% of its purchasing power, and the decline is accelerating. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon went on national television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. He called it temporary. It was permanent. And that single decision, made by one man in one evening, initiated the second stage of empire collapse that Glubb documented across every civilization he studied: currency debasement. The mechanism by which an empire funds its overextension by weakening the very medium of exchange that its economy depends on. Rome did it by reducing the silver content of the denarius from 95% pure silver under Augustus to less than 5% under Diocletian. Over 250 years, the coin that held the empire together was hollowed out until it was functionally worthless, and the empire had to resort to barter and taxation in kind because nobody trusted the currency anymore. Spain did it by flooding Europe with silver from the New World, which inflated prices across the continent and destroyed the purchasing power of the very currency that was supposed to make Spain rich. The more silver Spain imported, the less each unit of silver was worth, and the empire that controlled half the world's precious metals went bankrupt 4 times because the wealth it extracted was consumed by the inflation it created. Britain did it by printing pounds to fund 2 world wars, which destroyed the purchasing power of sterling and forced the 1949 and 1967 devaluations that signaled to the world that the pound was no longer a reliable store of value. And the United States has done it by printing dollars. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet went from $870 billion in 2007 to $8.9 trillion at its peak in 2022. That is a 10-fold expansion of the monetary base in 15 years. The M2 money supply, which measures the total amount of money circulating in the economy, increased from $7.4 trillion in 2007 to over $21 trillion by 2023. The dollars did not appear because the economy tripled in size. The economy grew by approximately 60% in that period. The rest of the money was created to fund government deficits, to bail out banks, to stimulate a pandemic economy, and to maintain the illusion that the empire could afford everything it was spending on without raising taxes or cutting programs. And the result is the 97% figure that should stop every American in their tracks. If you had $100 in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window, that $100 has the purchasing power of approximately $3 today measured against gold. Gold was $35 per ounce in 1971. It traded above $2,400 per ounce in 2025. That is not gold becoming more valuable. That is the dollar becoming less valuable. The dollar did not hold its value while gold surged. The dollar collapsed while gold maintained its purchasing power, which is exactly what gold has done for 5,000 years. And the CPI, which is the government's own measure of inflation, has recorded a cumulative increase of approximately 700% since 1971. That means an item that cost $1 in 1971 costs $8 today. A house that cost $25,000 costs $200,000. A car that cost $3,500 costs $35,000. A grocery bill that was $30 per week is $200, and the wages that were supposed to keep pace with those increases did not. The median household income in 1971, adjusted for the CPI, was approximately $10,290 in nominal terms. Today it is approximately $81,000. That sounds like an 8x increase, But the cost of housing has increased 10x, the cost of healthcare has increased 30x, the cost of education has increased 15x, the wages went up 8x, the costs went up 10 to 30x, and the gap between the two is the debasement. It is the invisible tax that the government imposed on every American by printing money to fund an empire it could not afford with the revenue it collected. And shadow government statistics estimates that if inflation were still measured using the pre-1994 CPI methodology, the actual cumulative purchasing power loss since 1971 would be closer to 99%, not 97%. Stage 2 is not approaching. Stage 2 has been running for 55 years, and every year it runs, the dollar buys less, the savings erode faster, the wages fall further behind, and the American worker works more hours to afford less life. That is currency debasement, and it is complete. Stage 3. The debt spiral crossed the point of no return. When the interest on the national debt exceeded the entire military budget, and the United States became a country that borrows to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. There is a moment in the debt spiral when the spiral becomes self-sustaining, when the government is no longer borrowing to build roads or fund schools or support research, or even to fight wars. When the government is borrowing to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. When the debt generates its own debt. When the ledger feeds on itself. And the United States crossed that threshold in fiscal year 2025. Net interest payments on the federal debt exceeded $1 trillion for the first time in American history. $1 trillion to service the debt, not to reduce it, to service it, to pay the interest. The way you pay the minimum on a credit card and the balance stays the same or grows, and the national debt that is generating that interest has reached $39 trillion. And the deficit, the annual gap between what the government collects and what it spends, is approximately $1.80 to $2 trillion per year, which means the government is adding $2 trillion in new debt every year on top of the $39 trillion it already owes. And the interest on the new debt gets added to next year's interest bill, which gets added to the year after that. And the Congressional Budget Office projects the debt rising to $50 trillion within a decade. And the debt to GDP ratio, which is the measure that determines whether a country can sustain its borrowing, has exceeded 120%. The threshold that the IMF and most economists consider dangerous is 90%. The United States blew past that years ago. And here is where the historical parallel is exact. Spain entered the debt spiral in the late 16th century. It borrowed from Genoese and German bankers to fund its wars in the Netherlands, its campaigns against England, and its defense of its New World colonies. The interest payments consumed an increasing share of royal revenue until the crown was paying more to service its debt than it was spending on the military that justified the borrowing. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1575, 1596, and 1607, 4 times in 50 years. Each time it restructured the debt, borrowed again, and the spiral resumed. And the empire shrank with each cycle because the creditors demanded harsher terms and the revenue base eroded as productive citizens fled the tax burden. Britain entered the debt spiral after World War I and accelerated it during World War II. The national debt reached 250% of GDP by 1946. And the empire spent the next 30 years liquidating its overseas assets, devaluing the pound, and dismantling the imperial architecture to service the debt it had accumulated. The Soviet Union entered the debt spiral in the 1980s when oil revenues fell and the cost of maintaining the military, the space program, the satellite states, and the domestic economy exceeded what the planned economy could generate. Gorbachev borrowed from Western banks. The interest compounded, and the empire ceased to exist within 900 days of the debt becoming unserviceable, and the United States in 2026 is paying $1 trillion in interest. It is borrowing $2 trillion per year. The CBO projects $50 trillion in debt within a decade. Central banks are reducing their dollar reserves. Gold purchases are at record levels. And the bond market, which is the mechanism through which the government borrows, is beginning to demand higher yields because the risk of lending to a government that cannot stop borrowing is increasing. And higher yields mean higher interest costs. And higher interest costs mean more borrowing. And more borrowing means higher debt. And higher debt means higher yields. The spiral feeds itself. It is the financial equivalent of a runaway nuclear reaction, and no political force in the United States, no party, no coalition, no candidate, no movement has proposed a plan to stop it, because stopping it requires cutting $2 trillion in annual spending or raising $2 trillion in annual revenue or some combination of both, And cutting $2 trillion means eliminating Social Security, or Medicare, or the military, or all discretionary spending. And raising $2 trillion means tax increases that no politician will survive proposing. So the spiral continues, the interest grows, the debt grows, the yields rise. And the empire that borrowed its way to greatness is now borrowing its way to the same destination that Spain reached in 1607, and Britain reached in 1946, and the Soviet Union reached in 1991. Stage 3 is complete. The spiral is self-sustaining, and there is no exit that does not involve pain. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity was completed when the United States went from manufacturing 28% of the world's goods to importing the products it once built and exporting the jobs that used to build them. In 1953, the United States manufactured 28% of the entire world's goods, 28%, one country, roughly 6% of the global population producing more than a quarter of everything that was made on Earth. The steel mills of Pittsburgh, the auto plants of Detroit, the electronics factories of the Rust Belt, the textile mills of the Carolinas, the shipyards of the Gulf Coast, the aircraft plants of Southern California, the machine tool shops of Connecticut and Ohio. America did not just design things, it built them. With American hands, on American soil, using American materials, employing American workers who earned wages that funded American communities that paid American taxes that supported American infrastructure. And the productive capacity of the country was the foundation on which every other pillar of the empire rested. The military was funded by manufacturing taxes. The dollar was strong because the goods it could buy were produced domestically. The trade balance was positive because the country exported more than it imported. And the middle class existed because manufacturing jobs paid $58,000 to $65,000 a year, with benefits, pensions, healthcare, and stability. And then over 40 years of policy decisions, the United States dismantled its own productive capacity. NAFTA in 1994 accelerated the movement of manufacturing to Mexico. China's entry into the WTO in 2001 opened the floodgates to offshoring. The ITF documented that China overtook the U.S. in total R&D investment for the first time. Foreign Affairs published a piece titled "America is Losing the Innovation Race." And the Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that the United States lost approximately 5.5 million manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2020. 5.5 million. And those were not jobs that were replaced by better jobs. The service economy jobs that absorbed the displaced workers pay half as much. Ohio lost 350,000 manufacturing jobs. The workers who held them went from $60,000 union jobs to $32,000 service jobs. They did not lose employment. They lost a class. And Spain did the same thing. At the peak of its empire, Spain imported manufactured goods from the Netherlands, England, and France because it was cheaper to buy with New World silver than to produce domestically. The wealth that flowed in from the colonies destroyed productive discipline. Why build a textile mill when you can buy textiles from Flanders? Why forge iron tools when you can import them from England? And within a generation, Spain's domestic manufacturing collapsed. And when the silver ran out, Spain had nothing to fall back on. No factories, no skilled labor, no productive economy, just a hollowed-out shell that had traded its industrial base for imported goods paid for with borrowed wealth. Britain did the same thing in the mid-20th century. The empire that pioneered the Industrial Revolution gradually shifted from manufacturing to finance. The City of London replaced the factories of Manchester and Birmingham as the engine of the economy. And by the 1970s, Britain was importing goods it once exported, running trade deficits it once never imagined, and experiencing deindustrialization that hollowed out entire regions of the country. And the United States today manufactures approximately 16% of the world's goods, down from 28%. It runs a trade deficit of approximately $800 to $900 billion per year. It imports more than it exports in virtually every product category except weapons, agricultural commodities, and intellectual property licenses. California, the wealthiest state, is importing gasoline from China. The country that put a man on the moon cannot refine enough fuel to drive to work. And the WION analysis from January 2026 stated it plainly. The U.S. designs, finances, and consumes, but it does not produce. That is the epitaph of every empire that reached stage 4. They stopped making things. They stopped building things. They outsourced their productive capacity to the countries they once dominated. And when the supply chains that connect those countries to the American consumer are disrupted by a war or a pandemic or a closed waterway, the shelves empty because there is no domestic production to fall back on. Stage 4 is complete. The factories are gone. The jobs are gone, the skills are gone. And the country that used to manufacture 28% of everything the world consumed now depends on the countries it once supplied to manufacture the things it needs to survive. Stage 5. Social decay was completed when 264,000 Americans started dying of despair every year. 90% of the country called it a mental health crisis, and the government that is supposed to hold the society together has 7% public confidence. Glubb identified social decay as the penultimate stage of empire, and he described its markers with a precision that reads like a checklist written for the United States in 2026. He wrote that the age of decadence is marked by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, frivolity, an influx of foreigners without assimilation, a surge in public debt, bread and circuses replacing civic responsibility, political corruption becoming normalized, family disintegration, loss of fertility, widespread drug use, and hedonism dominating the culture. And Glenn Beck, reading Glubb's markers on air in May 2025, went through them one by one and said, "Tell me if you cannot check every box on this one." And then he checked every single one. And the data for the United States in 2026 does not merely check the boxes, it obliterates them. There are 264,000 deaths of despair in the United States every year. Drug overdoses, alcohol-related deaths, and suicides. 264,000 Americans dying not from disease or accident or violence inflicted by others, but from the decision, conscious or unconscious, that continuing to live in this country in this economy under these conditions is not worth the effort, and the number has been climbing every year. The opioid crisis alone has killed over 700,000 Americans since 1999, more than every American who died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. And 771,000 Americans are homeless on any given night, according to the most recent point-in-time count, a record. And the majority of them work, they have jobs, they commute to employment, and then sleep in a car or a shelter or a tent, because the wages from the job do not cover the rent for the apartment. And 90% of American adults say the country is experiencing a mental health crisis. 9 out of 10, that is not a partisan number, that is consensus. And trust in the federal government, which is the institutional glue that holds a society together, is at 7% for Congress. 7%, a confidence level that is below the margin of error in most polls, meaning that within the uncertainty of the measurement, it is possible that trust in Congress is effectively zero. And 88 million eligible Americans did not vote in the 2024 election. That is not apathy. That is withdrawal. That is 88 million people who looked at the political system and concluded that participating in it would not change their life. And consumer sentiment is at an all-time record low of 44.8, according to the University of Michigan. And the Maplecroft Civil Unrest Index ranked the United States third in the world for risk of disruptive protests. Third, behind countries experiencing active political upheaval. And the fertility rate has fallen below replacement level for every demographic group in the country. Americans are not having children because they cannot afford to raise them in a country that charges $15,000 to $25,000 per year for childcare, $300,000 for a house, $80,000 for a degree, and $4.55 per gallon for the gas to drive to the job that does not pay enough to cover any of it. And Glubb wrote that no empire in his study survived stage 5 for more than a generation before entering stage 6. Because social decay is the disintegration of the bonds that hold the population together. The trust, the shared identity, the civic participation, the willingness to sacrifice for the collective good. And when those bonds dissolve, the population is no longer a society, it is a collection of individuals inhabiting the same territory with no shared commitment to its continuation. And a collection of individuals cannot sustain an empire. It cannot fund a military. It cannot maintain a currency. It cannot service a debt. It cannot produce goods. It can only consume what remains of the infrastructure the previous generations built, until that infrastructure crumbles and there is nothing left to consume. That is stage 5. It is complete. The bonds are dissolved. The trust is gone. The deaths of despair are climbing. The fertility is falling. The institutions are empty of credibility. And the population is holding on, not because the system works, but because the alternative to holding on is a void that nobody has been trained to navigate. Stage 5 does not end with a bang. It ends with 264,000 silent departures per year and 88 million people who stopped participating, and a country that says it is in a mental health crisis but cannot agree on who is responsible for treating it. Stage 6, loss of reserve currency status has just begun, and the dollar's share of global reserves has already fallen to 56.9%, the lowest since 1995, and the infrastructure to replace it is no longer theoretical. This is the stage you are living through right now. Not stage 5, which was completed before most of you noticed it was happening. Not stage 7, which has not arrived yet. Stage 6, the loss of reserve currency status. The moment when the world begins to move its financial architecture away from the empire's currency. And the data that marks the beginning of stage 6 is not ambiguous. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 71% in 2001 to 56.9% in 2025. That is a decline of 14.1 percentage points in 24 years. Nearly a fifth of the dollar's reserve dominance has been shed in less than a generation, and the pace is accelerating. Central banks around the world are buying gold at the fastest rate since records began. They are diversifying into euros, yuan, yen, and other currencies. They are building bilateral trade agreements that settle in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely, and BRICS, the bloc that now includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the UAE, has more aggregate economic weight in purchasing power parity terms than the G7. And $25 trillion per year flows through CIPS, China's alternative to the SWIFT messaging system that the United States uses to enforce financial sanctions. 25 trillion. That is an entire parallel financial infrastructure operating outside of American control. And the Iran war has accelerated stage 6 faster than any analyst predicted. Because the United States used the dollar as a weapon. It sanctioned Iran. It sanctioned Russia. It sanctioned any country or entity that transacted with sanctioned parties. And the countries that were sanctioned or threatened with sanctions looked at the dollar and concluded that any currency that can be weaponized against you is a currency you need to reduce your dependence on. And they did. And here is what makes stage 6 different from stages 1 through 5. Stages 1 through 5 are internal. They happen inside the empire. The military overextends, the currency debases, the debt spirals, the productive capacity is lost, the society decays. All of it is happening inside the borders, to the citizens, within the domestic economy. Stage 6 is external. It is the world's response to the internal decay. It is the moment when the other countries look at the empire and make a collective judgment that the currency is no longer a reliable store of value, the economy is no longer the indispensable engine of global trade, and the military is no longer the unchallenged guarantor of international security, and they begin building alternatives. And the alternatives, once built, do not get unbuilt. CIPS does not shut down because the US asks nicely. The BRICS Development Bank does not dissolve because America objects. The bilateral trade agreements in yuan and rupees and rials do not revert to dollars because Washington is uncomfortable. The infrastructure of de-dollarization is permanent. And every year it grows, the dollar's share of reserves falls further, and every percentage point it falls represents a reduction in the world's demand for dollars. And when demand for dollars falls, the value of the dollar falls. And when the value of the dollar falls, every American who earns, saves, borrows, and spends in dollars becomes poorer in real terms, even if the number on their paycheck stays the same. Britain experienced stage 6 between 1944 and 1971. The pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was replaced by the dollar through the Bretton Woods Agreement. And the transition took 27 years. It was not sudden. It was gradual, painful, humiliating. Britain went from the center of the global financial system to a junior partner of the country that replaced it. And the standard of living for ordinary British citizens declined for 2 decades as the imperial premium that had inflated their wages and subsidized their imports disappeared. The same process is beginning for the dollar. Stage 6 has started. The 56.9% is not the bottom, it is the slope, and the slope goes down from here. Stage 6 does not feel like a collapse. It feels like your dollar buying less every month at the grocery store, and the gas pump, and the pharmacy, and nobody being able to tell you why because the reason is something that no politician will say out loud. The loss of reserve currency status does not announce itself with a headline. There is no day when the dollar stops being the reserve currency. There is no vote, no declaration, no ceremony where the baton is passed. It happens the way the tide goes out, slowly, steadily, one transaction at a time. A Saudi oil sale settled in yuan instead of dollars. A Brazilian-Argentine trade agreement denominated in reals and pesos. An Indian refinery paying for Russian crude in rupees. A BRICS summit announcing a new settlement mechanism that does not touch the dollar. Each one of these transactions is invisible to the American consumer. You do not notice when Saudi Aramco accepts yuan for a tanker of crude. You do not read about it. It does not appear in your feed. But you feel it. You feel it at the grocery store when the price of imported olive oil goes up and you do not know why. You feel it at the gas pump when the price per gallon increases by 30 cents in a week and the explanation on the news blames the weather or the war, but does not mention that the dollar bought 2% less on the global market this month than it did last month. You feel it at the pharmacy when the copay on your prescription increases and the pharmacist shrugs and says insurance changed the formulary. You feel it in your mortgage payment when the interest rate on the home equity line ticks up a quarter point. You feel it everywhere, and you cannot name it. Because the thing you are feeling is de-dollarization. And nobody on television is going to say that word to you because saying it out loud acknowledges that the empire is losing the single greatest economic advantage it has ever had. The reserve currency privilege. The privilege that allows the United States to borrow at lower interest rates than any other country. The privilege that allows Americans to import goods denominated in their own currency while every other country has to earn dollars to buy oil and wheat and semiconductors and machine tools. The privilege that allows the Federal Reserve to print money without the immediate hyperinflationary consequences that printing money produces in every other country, because the world absorbs the excess dollars as reserve holdings. When that privilege erodes, everything reprices. Not overnight, over years, the way a beach erodes. You do not see the wave. You see the result when you come back next summer, and the shoreline has moved 10 feet. And here is what the repricing looks like for your life, specifically. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, which is a financial product that exists almost nowhere else in the world because it requires a deep liquid bond market backed by the world's reserve currency, becomes more expensive. The interest rate climbs, not because the Fed raised rates, because foreign buyers of Treasury bonds, the buyers who funded the cheap borrowing that made 3% mortgages possible, are buying less. And when demand for Treasuries falls, yields rise. And when yields rise, mortgage rates rise. And the family that locked in at 3% is fine. But the family trying to buy their first home at 7 or 8 or 9% is locked out. And the cost of imported goods rises because the dollar buys less on the global market. And 60% of the fresh fruit and 80% of the seafood and 30% of the vegetables that Americans consume are imported. And when the dollar weakens, those imports cost more. And the grocery bill goes up. Not because the farmer charged more, because the currency you used to pay for it is worth less than it was when the price was set. And the cost of energy rises because oil is still primarily priced in dollars, but the sellers increasingly accept yuan and rupees, and the petrodollar system that has recycled oil revenues back into treasury bonds since 1974 is unwinding. And the gas price and the electricity price and the heating bill all reflect a currency that is gradually losing the premium that made energy artificially cheap for Americans relative to the rest of the world. Stage 6 is not something that happens to the economy. Stage 6 is something that happens to you. Personally, at the register, at the pump, at the pharmacy, at the bank, and the reason nobody can explain it to you in a way that makes sense is because the explanation requires admitting that the American empire is losing its currency privilege, and admitting that is admitting that the empire is in stage 6 of a 7-stage collapse. And no politician, no central banker, no cable news anchor is going to say that to you. Because saying it makes it real. And real is the one thing that the entire system is designed to prevent you from seeing. Stage 7. The sudden collapse has not arrived yet, but every empire that reached stage 6 arrived at stage 7 within 5 to 15 years. And the speed of the transition shocked everyone who was living inside it. In 1985, the Soviet Union was the second most powerful country on Earth. It had 45,000 nuclear warheads. It had the largest conventional military force in the world. It controlled satellite states spanning from East Berlin to the Pacific. It had a space program that rivaled NASA. It had a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. And within 900 days, it ceased to exist. Not as a military power, as a country. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics dissolved on December 26, 1991. 15 republics became 15 independent nations. The ruble collapsed. Savings were wiped out by hyperinflation. The middle class was erased overnight. Male life expectancy dropped from 64 years to 57 years in a single decade. 7 years of life gone in 10 years. Oligarchs bought the country's industrial assets for fractions of a penny on the dollar in rigged auctions. And 280 million people who went to bed in a superpower woke up in a failed state that could not pay its pensioners or keep the heat running in Siberian winters. Nobody saw it coming. Not the CIA, which published an assessment in 1988 projecting the Soviet economy would remain stable. Not Western academic Sovietologists, the majority of whom expected reform, not dissolution. not the Soviet citizens themselves who assumed the system, for all its flaws, was permanent. And that is the defining characteristic of Stage 7. It is sudden. It is not the culmination of a gradual decline that everyone sees coming and prepares for. It is a phase transition. The way water is liquid at 33 degrees and ice at 31, the system looks stable right up until the moment it is not. And Spain experienced the same suddenness. In 1590, Spain was the richest empire on Earth. It controlled half the gold and silver reserves on the planet. Its military dominated Europe, and within 80 years it had declared bankruptcy for the fourth time, lost the Netherlands, lost Portugal, lost its military dominance, and became a secondary power that never recovered. 80 years from peak to irreversible decline. 3 generations, the children of the people who lived at the peak, grew old in a country their grandparents would not have recognized. And Britain experienced it faster. In 1945, Britain was one of the victors of World War II. In 1947, it could not afford to maintain its commitment to Greece and Turkey and handed the responsibility to the United States in what became the Truman Doctrine, the moment the torch was formally passed. In 1956, the Suez Crisis revealed that Britain could not project military power without American permission. In 1971, the pound was devalued for the final time and the last remnants of sterling's reserve status disappeared. 26 years from victory to dependence. 1 generation, and the speed of the transition is the thing that makes Stage 7 dangerous. Because the institutions, the businesses, the families, and the individuals who are planning for a gradual decline have not planned for a rapid one. They have not planned for the day when the bond market rejects a treasury auction and interest rates spike 200 basis points in a week. They have not planned for the day when a major trading partner announces it will no longer accept dollars for oil. They have not planned for the day when the stock market drops 30% in a month, as the AI bubble bursts and $20 trillion in paper wealth evaporates. They have not planned for the day when the SWIFT system is bypassed by a majority of global trade and the sanctions architecture that is America's primary tool of economic coercion becomes irrelevant. And Wyon's analysis stated it directly. Collapse, when it comes, is sudden, not gradual. Empires believe they are exceptional, but economic math overrides exceptionalism. And the medium analysis from February 2026 concluded with a warning that reads like an epitaph written in advance. A currency crisis, then a debt crisis, then a political crisis, then a rapid loss of superpower status. That is the sequence. It is the same sequence every time, and the United States is in Stage 6. The currency crisis has begun. The dollar share is at 56.9% and falling. The debt crisis is already embedded in the $39 trillion and $1 trillion in interest. The political crisis is visible in the 7% confidence and the 88 million who did not vote. And Stage 7, the rapid loss of superpower status, is the only stage that has not yet arrived. And history says the distance between Stage 6 and Stage 7 is measured not in generations but in years, 5 to 15. And the United States entered Stage 6 somewhere in the last decade, which means the window is not 50 years. It is not 30 years. It is the rest of this decade, and possibly the next. And the people who are alive right now, the people watching this video, are the generation that will either witness the transition or navigate it. There is no third option. The pattern says decline, history says collapse. But you are not a pattern, and you are not history. You are a person who can build something that survives the empire that built you. I have walked you through 7 stages: military overextension, currency debasement, the debt spiral, the loss of productive capacity, social decay, the loss of reserve currency status, and the sudden collapse that every empire before this one experienced at the end of the same sequence. And I know what you are feeling right now, because I feel it too. The weight of knowing that the country you grew up in, the country that shaped your identity and defined your opportunities and gave you the language you think in, is following a pattern that has ended every empire in 3,000 years of recorded human history. And the pattern does not care about American exceptionalism. It does not care about the Constitution. It does not care about Silicon Valley or Hollywood or the aircraft carriers or the nuclear arsenal. It cares about math, and the math, the debt, and the currency, and the trade balance, and the productive capacity, and the reserve share, and the social cohesion. The math has been the same for every empire, and the math for the United States matches the pattern at Stage 6 of 7. And I refuse to leave you there. Because here is the thing that Glob's framework does not account for. The people inside the empire are not the empire. The Roman citizens who survived the fall of Rome did not disappear. They adapted. They built local systems. They farmed, they traded, they formed communities that operated independently of the imperial infrastructure that had collapsed. And many of them lived lives that were smaller but more stable, more human, and more rooted in real relationships and real production than the lives they had lived under the empire. The British citizens who survived the loss of the empire did not disappear. They went through 20 painful years of adjustment and came out the other side with a national identity that was no longer dependent on ruling the world. It was painful. It was disorienting. But Britain did not end. It just stopped being an empire and started being a country. And the Soviet citizens who survived 1991, the ones who were not destroyed by the oligarchs or the poverty or the alcoholism or the 7-year drop in life expectancy, rebuilt. They built small businesses. They built communities. They adapted to a world that was fundamentally different from the one they had been told was permanent. And the pattern says decline. History says collapse. But you are not a pattern, and you are not history. You are a human being with the ability to build a life that does not depend on the empire to sustain it. And building that life is the only rational response to everything I have shown you in this video. Pay off your debt. Every dollar freed from 23.79% interest is a dollar that belongs to you instead of a bank. Build a 90-day food supply. Rice, beans, canned goods, pasta, cooking oil, peanut butter. The food you buy at today's prices is cheaper than the food you will buy in September. Build a cash reserve. $500 in small bills at home. When the digital systems glitch, cash works. Learn a skill that the post-imperial economy will need. Plumbing, welding, carpentry, cooking, repair, growing food, teaching, nursing, the trades that cannot be outsourced, automated, or replaced by an algorithm. Reduce your dependence on every system that is contracting. Drive less. Grow something. Cook from scratch. Fix what breaks instead of replacing it. And know your neighbors. I have said it in every video, I will say it in every video until the day I stop making them. Because the pattern that ends empires does not end people. People end when they are isolated. People end when they have no community. People end when the system that was taking care of them disappears and there is nobody next to them to fill the gap. The neighbor with the generator, the friend with the garden, the coworker who can carpool, the community that shows up when the empire does not. That is what survives stage 7. Not the military. Not the stock market, not the GDP, not the currency, the people, the ones who built something real while the empire was pretending everything was fine. The United States of America is 250 years old. It has completed 5 of the 7 stages of empire collapse. It has entered the 6th, and the 7th is coming. Not because I say so, because the pattern says so, and the pattern has been right for 3,000 years, but you are still here. And your family is still here. And your community is still here. And the things you build in the next 5 years will determine whether the transition is something that happens to you or something you navigate. Build now. Build quietly. Build with the people around you. And when the empire contracts, and it will contract, the life you built will be standing. Not because you predicted the future, because you prepared for it.